as you said, you can't get everything into one document. And a lot of the times, what a medical writer is being asked to do is create a form of marketing or a lead magnet or some resource that is designed to direct people towards another location. So like usually it's a website, like you said, with more information, more materials, subscribing to a newsletter or something like that. And so I think it's important to understand the difference between, writing for a website, for example, where all the call to actions are basically navigating somebody through the site. So hopefully they're flowing very easily from one page to the next and they're finding everything they want to find. They're not dropping off because they're not getting the information they need. And then it's leading them towards it, getting in touch with a company or, like I said, joining an email list or something like that. Those CTAs are very different because everything they need is already on that site and you're kind of navigating them through. Whereas with a standalone document or presentation or manuscript or something, you really are guiding them towards, other sources or other locations where they can expand on that. And yeah, if there's a marketing background, if there's branding behind it, then of course they want to use it to bring people to learn more about that product or service. So I think that distinction is just important to note. So I wanted to point that out as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And for a scientific audience, I remember one of the very early roles that I had was to write web content for a chemistry journal. And the CTA at the end, every single article that had the same CTA, which is a line that said, read the full article here. And that line was hyperlinked to the full article. So essentially, the piece was a summarization of the major key takeaways. And the CTA was read the full article here. And the purpose of using such a CTA was to improve readership for the journal, to try and get more people to recognize the fact that the journal exists and to get them accustomed to the flavor of articles that the journal publishes, so that when readers at some point want to publish something, because the readers were all scientific audiences, they might consider that journal as one potential platform or a stage on which they can showcase their research. So although CTA sounds, it may sound complex, but the simpler the CTA, the more chances of your reader actually implementing that CTA.
Yeah, I totally agree. They should be very simple. And I know that we want to also get into some of the considerations for developing a CTA. And I think the easiest way to approach that is to look at what can go wrong when it comes to CTAs and then sort of how to prevent that from happening, which naturally then leads to best practices. So I wanted to highlight the two areas in which I see people going wrong with CTAs the most. One is when the CTA comes completely unexpectedly. So it's not actually related to the content that has been leading up to that point. And so if you're not handling the objections that somebody might have to take that action before you tell them to take that action, they're not going to do anything. If it seems like if it doesn't make sense to the reader, if they are not convinced that that is the best approach, if they don't understand it, if it is coming completely out of left field, it's not going to give you the desired result. So I would say number one thing to make sure you're doing is that it's flowing from the story that you have planned. So we've talked a lot about, the point A and the point B of the story, understanding the audience and where they're coming from, what they need. And it's really important to make sure that CTA flows from that story and is a natural, a natural next step for the reader. It's not just, coming out of nowhere. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is that people will often try to put multiple CTAs into one piece. And it's very tempting to do that because there's so much more to learn. There's so much more they could do. You've probably touched on many different points and recommendations in the piece. But when I see that, I feel that it weakens the overall impact that the piece has, because what's the likelihood that someone's going to take 3 different actions as a result of reading something? You basically, you lose that momentum that you've just built up by having a very convincing, logical, scientific story that people can resonate with, and then you're confusing them because they're like, well, which of these should I be doing? Like, what do you want from me? And if there's too many, they'll just say, oh, I'm not going to bother because it's just too much effort. And so we talked about the simplicity, but in line with that, there really needs to be just one clear CTA and not multiple.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There has to be one clear CTA. And sometimes it's important to brainstorm that with a colleague or with someone else in order to gain clarity on what that CTA should be. It certainly helps to write down maybe 2 or 3 statements, which we consider as the call to action, and sit down with those statements and just do kind of a vote as to say which one would be most important here, which one is the top priority, and use that as the CTA. Now, the second best option might be very well written and very tempting, but if it doesn't satisfy the main objective of the call to action, if it doesn't take the audience exactly where they need to go next, then it's still second best. It's not the best option. So that's the other point that I'd like to convey. It's okay if you feel a bit confused as to what the CTA might be, and it's okay if you have to sit down with 2 or 3 statements and then have to vote as to which one you'd like to pick as your CTA.
Yeah, and I think often the client will be providing that objective beforehand when you're assigned the project, and it's up to you to kind of make sure you're staying on track with that, because it's very tempting to say, oh, enroll in this clinical trial, and also go and join this group and go and read about this and go and have this conversation. But when you really strip it back and you look at why this is being written in the first place and what you want people to be taking away from it, there is one very clear action that does stand out above the rest, and that is the one that you should lean into. Sometimes clients will push back and say that they want more than one CTA, and in most cases, you've got to do your best to try to keep it as simple and as natural as possible for people to take those steps. But I think if you can start with something that's very clear and very easy to follow and flows very well from the writing, you're going to have a really good first draft.
Absolutely. And taking this conversation over to the science, the medical / clinical world, sometimes you have to think about leading the audience to a place which has another CTA associated with it. Like, for instance, you can have an article leading an audience to a specific brochure that talks about a clinical trial, and the CTA of the clinical trial brochure leads to a website where they can enter their information to get more, to have a clinical trial nurse or a recruitment person contact them. So it's important to recognize that sometimes when the CTA is large, like for instance, enrolling yourself in a clinical trial is a huge ask. And sometimes if it's a clinical trial with children, the article is written for the parent, because obviously an 8-year-old is not reading scientific articles and trying to find out what clinical trial is best for them. It's the parent who's doing that job. And so asking a parent to enroll a child in a clinical trial is a massive ask. And you cannot possibly do it with one sentence that says click here. So you have to think about all the steps that are required in order for someone to, let's say, enroll themselves in a clinical trial. And each of those steps will have a CTA associated with it. So when you write something, you have to ask yourself, are there other steps involved in this process? And do those other steps already have CTAs? And how can I make my CTA aligned with all those other CTAs so it doesn't stick out?